Hello everyone, let's get started. This is APUSH Review, Period 7. Period 7 goes from 1890 to 1945, like we've already talked about. In this part, we're going to be looking at World War II. I divided this up into two sections. Part 1 is going to be pretty much what happens prior to America getting involved in World War II itself, and then Part 2 is the war itself and the American home front. So let's get right to it. So in Brinkley, it'll be covering chapter 25, and again, it's from 1921 to 1941, with the bulk of it coming in the 30s. Okay, so a big thing to know about after World War I, we're going to see the world in despair, especially Europe, especially Germany. And it's not going to be economic ruin or social despair like this. It's going to be actual physical ruins too. Germany was really devastated because of this war. And you'll see that there. And again, just a little briefly, after World War I, the economy was ruined, Germany was not doing very well, and the Treaty of Versailles put really all the blame on Germany itself. Germany was forced to pay about $32 billion to both France and England, and that was going to just devastate their economy. So to get out of that, what Germany did, they just printed a whole bunch of money. And what happened is that basically their mark, that's their system of dollar, basically just plummeted to astronomical levels, where basically their money was almost valueless by the 1920s. And that's going to ruin their economy. Okay, so now we get into, so that's sort of the big gist of the post-World War I economic landscape. Now let's look at American diplomacy. Pretty much after World War I, America is going to retreat from its small little interventionism and go back to isolationism. They're going to do that in several ways. One is by trying to limit not only their own navies, but also navies of other countries too. And so in 1921, under Warren Harding, you can make sure you sort of know that that's part of Warren Harding's presidency, the Washington Conference put limits on naval fleet sizes. And it was to several countries, but the three main ones was Japan, England, and America, with other countries like Italy and Spain and France also being part of this. It is going to put limits on overall tonnage and amount of ships. And of course, that's going to be one tactic to sort of deal with this global rise of imperialism and colonization and aggression. Another thing was the Kellogg-Briand Pact. A French diplomat, Briand, basically wanted to get involved in a more alliance-based system. And our diplomat Kellogg came in and basically talked about how we were going to make this pact, this grouping of 14 nations that are going to agree not to use war as the main way of diplomacy. And 14 nations will sign this. The problem is that there'll be very, very little oversight over what is or cannot be done. So again, this is something that shows our isolationism or sort of pullback from aggression or war, but very little oversight will be part of this. Okay, a big part of this 1920s time period was the amount of debt that Germany had, and also the amount of debt that France and England had because they owed so much because of the war. So in 1924, Charles Dawes basically came up with this plan to deal with this debt payment and this debt repayment. These are called circular loans. If you think about a circle, it goes around in a circle, correct? And so what we would do, we would take massive amounts of money, billions of dollars, and then basically loan that to Germany, or basically give that to Germany pretty much. With that money, what Germany is going to do is then provide reparation payments to France and England from the Treaty of Versailles. And with that money that France and England now are getting, they would repay World War I war debts back to the U.S. So the money we were loaning out to Germany will then go as reparation payments to England and France, will then come back to America in regards to our war repayments. And it doesn't really get Europe out of the depression or economically better, but it does tie America into the European economy much more deeply. And Charles Dawes will receive a Nobel Peace Prize from this because of this, at least allowing some economic flexibility in Europe. Okay, real quickly, a little rise of dictators. If you forgot about this from world history, here's some things about the rise of dictators. Of course, we have Germany. We have Adolf Hitler and the rise of the National Socialist parties. He's going to actually be elected official and then will take basically more power and dictatorial power later on. And of course, his very anti-Semitic, very Aryan approach against the Jewish population was very strung out and on display. He wrote that famous book called Mein Kampf. And in Italy, we had a fascist regime under the likes of Benito Mussolini. And again, he was appointed by the king rightfully, and then he took more dictatorial power. In 1935, he will invade Ethiopia, being really the first European country to be very aggressive on a foreign nation. Eventually, the Italians and the Germans will form an alliance between those two groups. And there's Ethiopia on the African map. The third part of the Axis powers is going to be Japan. Japan is going to be an empire. They're going to have a king or emperor who's going to be controlling them. But their leadership is going to be a military leadership. Hideki Tojo is going to basically take power from the appointed government and the prime minister when he basically stages a military coup and goes there and he and his military will assassinate and jail many of the government officials, thus making it a military regime. Part of their aggression will be to sort of getting up more room to expand into China. The first part they're going to expand into actually Manchuria, which is like present-day North Korea and those areas. Eventually, they're going to form the Tripartite Pact, which is going to be this Axis powers of Japan, Italy, and Germany. And that's Hideki Tojo there. Another leader that was a dictatorial leader, but was an ally during World War II, was Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin. Stalin will come to power as a communist leader of the Socialist Party in Russia or the Soviet Union, and he'll take that power when Vladimir Lenin dies. Eventually, secretly, he and the Germans will sign a non-aggressive pact, which will put them into a sort of a quasi-alliance until Germany will basically renege on that and attack the Soviet Union after it attacks Poland. And there's a doctored photo between Lenin and Stalin that was done. Again, he tried to make it seem like himself and Vladimir Lenin were close friends, but actually they weren't. Okay, two non-dictatorial leaders that had a very much big part of World War II. It's, of course, for the United States, FDR. He was elected president. Again, there's a lot of debate over did he take more congressional and executive power than he probably should have. He was elected 4 terms, of course. And, of course, the leader for England was Winston Churchill. He was elected leader, obviously, himself, too. And in this time period, America was also pulling back from interventionism in Latin America. FDR came up with this idea called the good neighbor policy. We was going to ease on military control over Latin America, especially Mexico, but continue to basically influence them economically. His quote was, "No state has the right to intervene in the internal or external affairs of another." So he's going to pull back on that big stick and dollar diplomacy and sort of be an economic influence in Latin America, but not so much a military influence in those areas. Another thing that came about that was really big to sort of promote American isolationism was Gerald Nye. He was a senator that really thought there was a big conspiracy about how World War I started. His thought was that a big push from World War I was by the bankers, Wall Street, the big business, the arms makers that pushed Congress to be very aggressively active to join the war. And this Nye Commission sort of came up with that the war could have been avoided, or at least, done differently if there was more government connections to sort of limit the amount of what capitalist business or banks could do in regards to war and nation. So this is going to be a big part of why we have the Neutrality Acts that are enacted to sort of limit American involvement in the ongoing aggressions in World War II. And of course, it's going to push us to American isolationism. The Neutrality Acts. Neutrality Acts of 35, 36, and 37 were all acts at one major thing. Again, really important to know this. The major goal of these was to keep America neutral, out of the war. Make sure that American ships, American businesses, American entrepreneurs were not pulling us into war that would make us officially have to declare war. So what they did, they outlawed weapon sales to warring nation. Pretty much, if you were a country, it doesn't matter if you were the belligerent, which means the attacker, or the attackee, it would require America not to sell you weapons. We could still sell you food and stuff like that. But even goods, you would have to pay for them upfront with cash and carry them back on your own ships. So again, we could sell, Germany, foodstuffs or oil or other things like that, but they would have to use their own ships to transport those goods and pay cash and not debt with them. Again, this would alleviate American vessels to be put into harm's way by a potential attack. And again, that the main goal was to keep us isolationist. And FDR's quarantine speech in 1937 was really because Japan was becoming more and more aggressive towards China. What he did, he proclaimed that any aggressor nations would have to be quarantined by the international community. Pretty much, exactly what was going on. It was that they were not going to be dealt with, traded with, or internationally handled the same way as a non-warring nation. Where this came to test was in China just a couple weeks after the speech. The USS gunboat Panny was up in a Chinese river, and it was blatantly in broad daylight attacked by a Japanese plane, and it was destroyed. And rather than basically going to war or making changes because of this, FDR was really pushed by isolationists to do nothing. So he didn't do anything there. He kept America out of the war at this time period rather than being more aggressive. So this was America's involvement of something called appeasement, and what we could have done maybe differently to sort of quell Japanese growth and their aggressiveness. Okay, the next couple are just sort of just recap slides about what transpired to go from aggressing to actual war. So in this time period, you learned from last year from world history this term called appeasement, which was really France and England really giving in to Germans' demands to avoid war at all costs. Germany will basically take Austria, they'll take Czechoslovakia or parts of it, they'll rearm their military, they're going to rearm their navy, they're going to start building an air force, they're going to start pretty much getting involved and expanding into the Rhineland, which is that area right next to France. And really nothing is done to stop them or to check them. The Prime Minister of this time period was Neville Chamberlain. And in his famous Munich conference, he basically said, we have peace for all time. When he came back from Munich talking to Hitler, he gives in to Hitler's demand and basically says that Hitler has gotten his last peace and he's not going to request anymore. Literally weeks after this happened is when Germany is going to first attack Poland. This is not going to work. And we see here that we see Uncle Sam in the snow, Nazism falling all around him. You see this, it says, "Let me alone." It's so peaceful here. And I do this, and it's a path to appeasement. So it's sort of, America is also falling to this. They aren't really doing anything to stop this aggressive trend. And again, they thought that Europe should handle Europe. And what we could have done is probably put some sort of limits on Japan earlier than we did. Okay, so Germany starts World War II by attacking Poland in September 1st, 1939. This will start a global war because England and France are official allies with this. Pretty much they will run through Poland with blitzkrieg or lightning war. Within 1 month. Poland is devastated and surrenders. America still stays neutral at this point. And then they basically roll through Europe within the next year. They overtake Norway, they overtake Denmark, they overtake Netherlands, Belgium, then they roll into France. They take France also. The only really piece of Europe that's left that's either not neutral or is not taken over is England, Great Britain. It's an island, so there's a tactical problem with invading it. But the Germans will try to basically bombard the British with months and months of heavy bombing. Really, there's two things that keep the English from having these ultimate devastating losses. One is a new type of invention called radar, that they were able to then detect German planes and German sorties over their bombing campaigns. So they're able to sort of warn their citizens to get into bunkers. The second thing that saved thousands of lives is the huge amount of underground railways or subways that London had. And so because of these radars and these advanced warnings, thousands of British could then flee into the subways to be saved. Also, anyone that was deemed non-essential, or all children pretty much, were taken to the countryside, or basically pushed out of London, out of Manchester, out of those big cities, into the country areas, into homes and family members and other places. So London and Manchester and other places like that would be really just for the people that needed to be there. Okay, so obviously with this happening, our American neutrality was definitely being tested. So Congress pleaded to lighten up on this cash and carry policy. So they did that. So this cash carry policy was revised to include weapons. So basically, we could start sending weapons to our friendly allies. Again, we aren't officially allied with anyone yet, but we could send weapons to them if they paid cash for them, and they picked those weapons up on their own ships. Obviously, a group that was very much against this was called the Americas First Committee. They were against interventionism. These are people like Gerald Nye, Charles Lindbergh, were two really famous people that were part of this America First Committee. And they were very much isolationist. The next two cartoons you're going to see were done by Dr. Seuss, basically at the, talking about getting us more involved with the war. So they were done, to promote the war effort, or to get people to persuaded that this America First Committee is not so good. It says, and the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones, but those were foreign children and didn't really matter. The second one, again, you see the America First Committee and Nazism over there. You can see their beards tied together. And on this platform, folks, those were the most perplexing people, the lads with the Siamese beard, unrelated by blood. They were joined in a manner that mystifies the mightiest of minds of the land. Again, by Dr. Seuss. At this point, Franklin Roosevelt will do something unprecedented, never done before or again. He will run for a third term, and he's going to win pretty handily. You see that he basically dominates the South, he dominates the West, and there's still a few states in the Midwest and the North that do not vote for him. Population-wise, 54% of the population, which is a very strong number, goes out to vote for him for the third term. At this point, England basically had ran out of money. They ran out of money to do it. So we did two things. One thing I want you to write down, and then the next thing I want you to sort of look at your notes while you do this. One thing I want you to look at also, something that's not there. I should probably put this up here also. I'll put this in the text box. Let's go there, right there, okay. Okay, so what I want you to put down is destroyers for basis deal. And what that was that America was going to basically give England destroyers. Destroyers were ships that were smaller than battleships, and what they were doing, they were great for hunting down submarines and protecting convoys. And so these destroyers were going to be given to England in exchange for basically British naval bases and bases around the world. So we were going to give U.S. destroyers in exchange for British naval bases. And that's going to come, after that will come the Lend-Lease Act, which will happen in 1940 also. And basically what the Lend-Lease Act does, it allows America basically to give England weapons without having England to actually have to pay for these weapons. And so this can be a huge amount of weapons are going to be going from America to England. And we'll actually start using our own vessels to take those supplies over to England also. Okay, let's just write this down. U.S. Destroyers. Okay. So we're going to see massive amounts of American goods going from America to England. And what that's going to happen is that we are going to start seeing American vessels being targeted by German U-boats. At this point, American FDR still are going to have the response of not getting directly involved in the war at this point. In 1941, we'll have the first official meeting of alliances between FDR and Churchill. This is going to be a secret meeting in the North Atlantic Ocean between these two leaders on a U.S. Battleship. And this will sort of plan out of how America is going to sort of go forward in pushing for a engagement into the war itself. Officially, they are not allied with each other, but this is an unofficial alliance of these two countries. At this point, let's move to Asia. We had already been sort of warning Japan for taking aggressive actions. As you see here, Japan's right there, and they will go into Manchuria into basically the early 1930s. And then they'll move down into basically China in 37. Then they'll take in even more parts of China in 38. They'll take a little more parts of China in 39. In 1940, they're even going to move into basically this French Indochina at this point. At that point, they are going to take a very bold action. We'll get to it in a second. But what America does first is we cut off their trade, or we embargo them. In 1940, after this right there, when they signed the Tripartite Pact, this alliance between Germany, Italy, and Germany, we cut off oil and steel shipments to Japan. And what we really thought is that where the Japanese would probably attack us was in our naval bases and our military bases in the Philippines. Because the Philippines, again, remember, was an American colony at this point still. We had no, basically, thought that they would ever try to attack us either on the west coast of America or in Hawaii itself, at this point at least. So the attack on Pearl Harbor was definitely how can I put it? It was a surprise to America. We knew that they had the capability of attacking us. We just never thought they would actually do it. We actually received a message from the Peruvian embassy that they had picked up some transmissions that they were going to attack Pearl Harbor and Hawaii. We just didn't think it was going to happen. So we prepared not for the attack on an external force onto this island. What we were worried about as Americans is that actually they would have either spies or agents that would come over and attack these ships or these bases from within. So instead of having all the ships spread out or out of port, we basically put all our ships really close together so we could easily defend them from people sneaking on them. And I'll go back there, but you see that a lot of the ships were tied up 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 because this was the best way to defend them is by having all these ships sort of like close together and in close proximity to each other. You see the more battleships because it was going to be an easier ability to defend them that way by having them tied together like this. So December 7, 1941, the Japanese are going to attack Pearl Harbor. In this attack, 2,400 Americans die, 18 ships, and 188 planes destroyed. Again, luckily though, none of our aircraft carriers from the Pacific Fleet were in port that day. Also, they did not destroy our oil reserves, which was going to be a big deal because those Navy oil reserves right there was going to be a big part of us winning the war eventually, by having those aircraft carriers and oil. Our response, of course, will be that we are going to prepare for war. FDR will give his famous speech, a date that will live in infamy, on December 7th. The next day he'll call this important date, December 7th will be this date. And of course, we declare war on Japan. Thus, Germany and Italy will also declare on war on us. Okay, so the island that was attacked was going to be Oahu, and Honolulu is right there. the south-facing port, and Pearl Harbor is right there. And in the waves, there are going to be two different waves that come in. Early wave about 8 o'clock a.m. and a second wave. They could easily done a third wave, but they decided that the element of surprise had already left, so they decided not to send a third wave to devastate American forces even more. Here's some pictures of the attack itself. And there's the USS Arizona, one of the most famous battleships that was lost during this battle. After the battle happened, you see that what we did with a lot of these ships, we were able to salvage them. Again, we weren't going to be able to completely reuse this ship, but we were able to salvage it for metal to be remade into new ships, which is going to be huge. Eventually, one ship is going to be commemorated as a National Historical Landmark and a grave site. It's going to be the USS Arizona. Most of the lives lost in Pearl Harbor will be on the Arizona, with many of the people actually being trapped in the ship itself as it sunk. So this right there is not a museum, but is actually a memorial that is basically giving homage to all the sailors who died on the Arizona that day. And you see they left the hole down there. You can still see oil leaking up there. And again, that's the hull of the Arizona. It's still in the exact same spot where it was sunk on that day. And you can see another picture of it. Okay, so that is our lecture for the day. There's going to be a part 2 coming up right after this. Please email or give me any comments in the feedback below. And I hope you enjoyed. Hope this helps with your review. And let's keep going, guys. Have a good one.